The moment I realized my own divorce lawyer was working against me, I stopped feeling angry. I became careful. The proof was sitting in front of me during a settlement meeting. A document my attorney had promised was confidential suddenly appeared in my ex-husband's hands. Not similar, not summarized, the exact document. The same formatting, the same notes, the same mistake in the footer. My stomach dropped. The room felt smaller. My lawyer avoided eye contact. My ex-husband smiled for half a second before catching himself. That tiny smile told me everything. They thought I was trapped. They thought I was desperate, disorganized, predictable. What they didn't know was that I'd spent 30 years building a business by studying people before making decisions. And the moment I realized they were working together, I stopped protecting the truth. Instead, I started feeding them lies. Very expensive lies.
3 months before that meeting, I still trusted my attorney. That sounds ridiculous now. But trust rarely disappears all at once. It erodes quietly, like water finding cracks in concrete. The first warning arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I was sitting inside a coffee shop across from my accountant's office. The windows were fogged from the weather. People hurried past carrying umbrellas while I reviewed property records spread across the table. My attorney, Richard, had assured me that certain financial disclosures would remain strategically private until the appropriate stage of negotiations. 2 days later, my ex-husband somehow knew about them. Not generally. Specifically. Too specifically. At first, I convinced myself it was coincidence. After all, 27 years of marriage leaves a person with plenty of knowledge. But coincidences have limits. And this one kept happening. Every confidential discussion somehow reached the other side. Every strategic move lost its advantage. Every negotiation felt like someone was reading tomorrow's newspaper before it was printed. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Yet proving it was another matter entirely. Accusations without evidence are just emotions dressed as facts. I needed more than suspicion. I needed certainty. One evening I sat alone in my kitchen. The house felt unusually large after the separation. The refrigerator hummed softly. A clock ticked somewhere in the hallway. Outside, summer insects buzzed against the screened windows. I spread legal paperwork across the dining table. Page after page after date. Conversation after conversation. Looking for something I had missed. Then I noticed it. Every leak originated from information shared exclusively with Richard. No exceptions. I leaned back in my chair. The realization settled over me slowly. Heavy, uncomfortable, but strangely clarifying. Because once uncertainty disappears, decisions become easier. The next morning I called my accountant, Linda. Not from my home. Not from my cell phone. From a quiet park several miles away. Children played near a fountain while retirees walked small dogs around a winding path. Normal life continued around me while mine quietly changed direction. I need your honest opinion, I told her. A pause. Then she said something that still echoes in my mind. Are you asking because you think someone is leaking information or because you already know they are? I looked across the water. I think I know. Another pause. Longer this time. Then don't confront anyone yet. Smart advice. Not dramatic. Not satisfying. But smart. Most people think strategy begins with action. It doesn't. Strategy begins with observation. So I watched. For weeks. I became quieter. Less reactive. Less emotional. Exactly what they expected from someone who was losing. And that's when I started noticing things. Richard became unusually confident during meetings. My ex-husband stopped appearing nervous. Settlement demands grew more aggressive. Almost arrogant. Like someone who believed they already knew my next move. Because they did. Or at least they thought they did. By early autumn, I made a decision. If information was being stolen, I would decide what information got stolen. The idea wasn't to create some elaborate movie-style trap. Real life doesn't work that way. The goal was simpler. Discover exactly how far the betrayal went, and who was benefiting from it. The first false report was intentionally harmless. A document suggesting I might liquidate a small investment account. Nothing illegal. Nothing fraudulent. Just misinformation. Information shared only through Richard. No one else. Within 6 days, my ex-husband's legal team suddenly changed their negotiation position regarding that exact account. I nearly laughed when I saw it. Not because it was funny. Because confirmation carries its own strange relief. The uncertainty was gone. The leak was real. That night I drove home through downtown traffic. Streetlights reflected across wet pavement. People filled restaurants and sidewalk patios. Life looked warm. Connected. Normal. I, meanwhile, was learning that the person legally obligated to protect my interests had been quietly selling pieces of my future. The betrayal hurt more than I expected. Not because of the money. Because trust once broken changes how you see everyone. For several days I considered reporting him immediately. Ending it. Exposing everything. But another question kept bothering me. Who else knew? My ex-husband? Obviously. But was he directing it? Funding it? Or simply benefiting from it? I needed answers before making accusations. Because once a confrontation begins, people start destroying evidence. So I continued the performance. I arrived at meetings looking tired. I occasionally misplaced harmless paperwork. I asked questions I already knew the answers to. Nothing excessive. Nothing theatrical. Just enough to reinforce the image they already believed. A woman under pressure. A woman losing control. A woman cornered. The more they believed it, the more careless they became. And carelessness leaves footprints. Then came the moment everything changed. A confidential financial summary I had intentionally fabricated surfaced in a settlement proposal less than 48 hours after Richard received it. Not pieces of it. All of it. Every detail. Every number. Every false lid. Someone wasn't merely sharing information anymore. Someone was actively building strategy around it. I stared at the document in silence while the conference room buzzed with legal discussion. Across the table, my ex-husband looked unusually pleased with himself. Richard avoided my eyes again. And suddenly I understood something terrifying. They didn't just think I was losing. They believed they had already won. Which meant they had no idea what was coming next. Because while they were chasing the fake assets, I had quietly begun documenting every leak, every timeline, every conversation, every suspicious coincidence. And the picture forming behind the scenes was becoming much larger than a divorce case. Much larger than money. It was becoming a story of professional misconduct, hidden payments, and a betrayal that could destroy more than one career. The question was no longer whether I could prove it. The question was whether I was ready for what would happen when I did. And the answer arrived 3 days later. Inside an envelope that was never supposed to reach me. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning. No return address. No note. Just a plain white envelope tucked between utility bills and grocery advertisements. At first I almost threw it away. Almost. Something about its weight made me pause. I carried it into the kitchen. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the coffee machine hissed in the background. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon from a candle I'd forgotten to extinguish the night before. Small details. Ordinary details. The kind that become permanently attached to extraordinary moments. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A photocopy. Nothing more. Yet within 10 seconds my entire understanding of the situation changed. The document contained an invoice. Not from my attorney. Not directly. But from a consulting company I had never heard of. What caught my attention wasn't the company. It was the payment description. The invoice referenced Strategic Asset Review Consultation. The amount wasn't enormous, but it wasn't small either. And attached to the payment record was a name. My ex-husband's business manager. I stared at it, then stared again. The pieces didn't fit. Not yet. But they were beginning to form a shape. A dangerous shape. For several minutes I simply sat there. The clock above the stove ticked steadily. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled down the street. Life continued normally. Meanwhile, my divorce case had just become something else entirely. Because if money was moving through third parties, someone was trying very hard not to leave fingerprints. And people only hide fingerprints when they know they're doing something they shouldn't. The question was obvious. Who sent the envelope? I had no answer. No note. No explanation. But whoever mailed it knew enough to be nervous. And nervous people sometimes become valuable allies. That afternoon I met Linda at a quiet waterfront restaurant. Wind pushed small waves against the docks. Fishing boats rocked gently in their slips. Tourists wandered nearby carrying ice cream cones and shopping bags. An oddly peaceful setting for the conversation we were having. I slid the photocopy across the table. She studied it, then looked up. Her expression had changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough for me to notice. "That's not good," she said. I nodded. I figured. She lowered her voice. "You don't understand. That's really not good." A cold feeling settled in my chest. Because Linda wasn't someone who exaggerated. Everybody. She explained what worried her. The invoice itself proved very little. By itself, it meant almost nothing. But combined with the leak pattern, combined with the timing, combined with the behavior we'd already documented, it created questions that investigators would eventually ask. And once investigators start asking questions, people begin making mistakes. For the first time, I saw genuine concern in her eyes. Not concern for the divorce, concern for what happened after. Because professional reputations take decades to build. And sometimes 1 month to destroy. I drove home in silence. The city skyline glowed orange beneath the setting sun. Traffic moved slowly across the bridge. Everyone around me seemed headed somewhere. Meeting family. Meeting friends. Returning to ordinary lives. I couldn't remember what ordinary felt like anymore. Not really. For months I'd been living inside a chess match disguised as a legal proceeding. And now the board was expanding. That evening Richard called unexpectedly. His voice sounded unusually friendly. Too friendly. Like a salesman who already believed the deal was done. "We should discuss settlement options," he said. "Things are moving quickly." I nearly smiled. Of course they were. They thought their pressure campaign was working. They thought the misinformation I'd planted reflected my actual concerns. Every false financial report. Every fake asset trail. Every carefully placed breadcrumb. They had consumed all of it. And now they were making decisions based on fiction. "I've been thinking," I told him. A long pause followed. The kind people make when they're listening very carefully. I may need to accept less than I originally wanted. His response came too quickly. Too eagerly. "I think that's a wise approach." There it was. Not proof. But confidence. Dangerous confidence. The confidence of someone who believed he already knew the ending. After hanging up, I wrote detailed notes. Exact wording. Every interaction now went into a growing file. No assumptions. No emotional commentary. Just facts. Clean. Precise. Documented. Because facts survive scrutiny. Emotions don't. Weeks passed. Autumn deepened. Leaves gathered along sidewalks. Cold air replaced summer humidity. The divorce negotiations intensified. And with every new proposal, something remarkable happened. The opposition kept reacting to information that wasn't real. Again. And again. And again. Each reaction created another timestamp. Another breadcrumb. Another piece of evidence. It was almost as if they were documenting the leak for me. Then came the meeting that nearly exposed everything. A private conference room on the 21st floor of a downtown office building. Glass walls. Gray skies on expensive furniture. The kind of place designed to impress people. Halfway through the discussion, my ex-husband referenced a financial restructuring plan. A plan I had never actually created. A plan that existed only inside a fabricated report sent exclusively through Richard. For a moment, the room went silent. Not visibly. Not dramatically. But inside my head, everything stopped. Because he'd said it out loud. He'd revealed knowledge he should not possess. And he didn't even realize it. I watched Richard immediately shift the conversation. Too quickly. Too smoothly. Almost like a reflex. The movement lasted only seconds. But it told me everything. The panic was there. Hidden beneath professional composure. But visible if you knew where to look. And I was watching very closely. That night I barely slept. Not because I was afraid. Because I finally understood the scale of what was happening. This wasn't a single bad decision. This wasn't a momentary lapse in ethics. This was a pattern. A system. A relationship operating behind closed doors while everyone assumed the process was fair. And if I was seeing only part of it, How much existed beneath the surface? The answer began arriving 48 hours later. Through someone I never expected. Someone who had remained completely invisible until that moment. Someone whose name had never appeared in a single document. Someone who had apparently been watching the entire situation from the sidelines. My ex-husband's former executive assistant. And when she contacted me, she claimed she had records. Not opinions. Not suspicions. Records. Emails. Calendar entries. Payment schedules. Information that could explain exactly how deep the betrayal went. But before she would hand over anything, she wanted one thing from me. A guarantee. Not about money. Not about legal protection. Something far more personal. When she told me what it was, I realized the next chapter wasn't going to be about winning a divorce anymore. It was going to be about deciding how much truth I was willing to uncover. The message arrived at 6:14 on a Friday evening. No greeting. No introduction. Just a single sentence. I know why your attorney keeps avoiding direct questions. I stared at my phone while commuters flowed around me outside a downtown bookstore. Cars crawled through rush-hour traffic. A bus hissed to a stop nearby. The city moved exactly as it always had. Yet for the second time in a few months, a single message had the power to change everything. The sender identified herself as Andrea, my ex-husband's former executive assistant. The same woman who had worked beside him for nearly 12 years. Long enough to know where the skeletons were buried. Long enough to recognize when something wasn't right. Long enough to become dangerous. Not because she was malicious. Because she had information. And information makes people nervous. We agreed to meet 2 days later. Sunday morning. A public location at a botanical garden cafe on the edge of town. Open space. Lots of people. No privacy. Exactly how both of us preferred it. When you've spent months learning how easily trust can be misplaced, caution stops feeling paranoid. It starts feeling responsible. The morning arrived cold and gray. The garden paths glistened from overnight rain. Water droplets clung to rose petals and magnolia leaves. Families wandered among the exhibits while retirees lingered over coffee and newspapers. Beautiful. Peaceful. The kind of setting where nobody expected life-changing conversations. Andrea was already seated when I arrived. She looked older than I expected. Not physically. Emotionally. The way people look after carrying something heavy for too long. She wasn't nervous. She was tired. There is a difference. I almost didn't contact you, she said after we ordered coffee. I believed her. Her hands remained steady. Her voice remained calm. She wasn't seeking drama. If anything, she seemed uncomfortable being there at all. Then why did you? Andrea looked through the cafe window toward the gardens. For several seconds, she didn't answer. Then she sighed. Because eventually you reach a point where staying silent feels worse than speaking. That answer stayed with me. Because it sounded familiar. It sounded like something I might have said myself. She didn't begin with documents. She began with a story. Months earlier, she explained, she'd noticed unusual calendar entries appearing around important stages of my divorce proceedings. Private meetings, unexplained lunches, consultations that weren't listed under normal business categories. At first, she ignored them. Executives have private meetings all the time. Nothing unusual about that. Until patterns started forming. The same names kept appearing. The same locations. The same dates. Often immediately before major developments in my case. Andrea wasn't an investigator. She wasn't looking for misconduct. She simply managed schedules for a living. And schedule managers notice patterns the way musicians notice rhythm. It's impossible not to. Then one afternoon she accidentally received an email she wasn't meant to see. Not because anyone included her intentionally. Someone clicked the wrong recipient. A simple mistake. The kind that happens every day. Yet sometimes entire lives change because of one wrong click. I remember staring at it, she said quietly. I thought maybe I misunderstood. What was in it? She hesitated. Not because she didn't want to answer. Because she was remembering. And memories carry weight. Especially the ones that force you to reevaluate people you thought you understood. It discussed legal strategy. My stomach tightened. She continued. Specific legal strategy regarding your settlement negotiations. A cold silence settled between us. The sounds of the cafe seemed farther away. Muted somehow. As if my brain had turned the volume down on everything except her voice. Could it have been legitimate? I asked. Business discussion, general advice? Andrea shook her head. No. One word. Simple. Certain. Final. I worked around executives for 20 years. I know the difference. She reached into her bag. My pulse quickened. But instead of documents, she removed a small notebook. Old-fashioned. Paper pages. Handwritten notes. The kind of thing people keep for themselves. Not for courts. Not for lawyers. For memory. For survival. Inside were dates. Meeting locations. Names. Nothing dramatic. Nothing sensational. Just records. Consistent records. Month after month. Entry after entry. Tiny fragments that formed a larger picture when placed together. A picture neither Richard nor my ex-husband would appreciate. The most chilling part wasn't the information itself. It was how ordinary it looked. People imagine corruption as dramatic secret meetings in dark rooms. Real life rarely looks like that. Real life looks like lunch reservations. Calendar updates. Phone calls. Invoices. Small decisions accumulating over time. Quietly. Almost invisibly. Until one day the pattern becomes impossible to deny. For over an hour we talked. Not just about documents. People. Motives of fear. The strange things otherwise intelligent adults do when they become convinced they won't get caught. Andrea never sounded angry. That surprised me. Mostly she sounded disappointed. As though she'd spent years respecting individuals who eventually revealed different versions of themselves. Then she finally told me why she left her job. And the answer changed everything. Because it wasn't about my divorce. Not directly. It was about something she witnessed shortly afterward. Something that convinced her the behavior wasn't isolated. Something that suggested my case may not have been the only situation where professional boundaries had quietly disappeared. The realization hit me slowly. Like distant thunder rolling across water. If she was right, then exposing what happened to me could trigger questions far beyond one marriage. Far beyond one attorney. far beyond one settlement. And suddenly the stakes felt much larger. Before leaving, Andrea handed me a sealed folder. Thin, neatly organized, far less dramatic than movies would suggest, yet somehow more powerful. Because real evidence usually looks boring. Until someone reads it carefully. "Don't open it here," she said. "Why?" Her eyes met mine. For the first time that morning, genuine concern appeared in her expression. "Because once you know what's inside." She paused. "You won't be able to unknow it." I drove home through light rain. Windshield wipers swept steadily back and forth. The folder rested on the passenger seat beside me. Ordinary. Heavy. Not because of its weight. Because of its potential. Part of me wanted answers. Another part feared them. Because answers have consequences. And consequences don't always arrive where you expect. That evening I sat alone in my study. The house was quiet. A lamp cast warm light across the desk. Outside, branches tapped softly against the windows. The sealed folder remained untouched for nearly an hour. I simply stared at it, thinking, wondering, preparing myself. Eventually, I opened it. Inside were emails, meeting logs, payment records, timelines. Enough information to establish connections. Enough information to raise serious questions. Enough information to make several people very uncomfortable. Then I found the final page. And that's when my hands stopped moving. Because buried among the records was a name I never expected to see. A name connected not to my ex-husband. Not to Richard. But to someone much closer to me. Someone who had spent months pretending to support me. Someone who had sat in my kitchen. Shared coffee with me. Listened to me cry. And apparently reported everything back to the people trying to undermine me. For a long moment I couldn't breathe. Because betrayal from an enemy hurts. But betrayal from someone sitting beside you, that changes the way you remember every conversation that came before. And suddenly I realized the most dangerous person in this entire story had never been across the table. They'd been standing right next to me all along. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of the documents. Not because of the money. Because of the name. The name sitting on that final page. Rebecca. My closest friend. For 17 years. The woman who had helped me move into my first apartment after college. The woman who stood beside me when my father died. The woman who brought soup to my house after surgery. Rebecca. The rain continued long after midnight. I sat alone in the study reading the folder again and again, hoping I had misunderstood something. A typo. A coincidence. Anything. Every timeline matched. Every communication aligned. Every detail pointed in the same direction. Rebecca wasn't accidentally involved. She was connected. Directly. Repeatedly. Consistently. And suddenly dozens of old memories began rearranging themselves. Like puzzle pieces finally finding their correct places. Moments that once seemed harmless now felt different. Questions she'd asked. Information she'd requested. Conversations she'd steered. Advice she'd offered. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. That's what made it frightening. The manipulation wasn't loud. It was subtle. Patient. Careful. Almost invisible. The next morning she called. My phone lit up with her name. For several seconds I simply stared at it. A year earlier I would have answered immediately. Now my hand remained still. Eventually I picked up. "Hey," she said warmly. The familiar voice felt strangely unfamiliar. "How are you holding up?" A simple question. Yet suddenly it sounded rehearsed. Measured. Fishing for information. "I'm managing," I said. Nothing more. Nothing less. The silence that followed lasted barely 2 seconds. Yet it felt important. Because Rebecca always filled silence. Always. This time she seemed cautious. Careful. Listening. Evaluating. And for the first time I realized she'd probably been doing that for months. Maybe years. After we hung up, I made a decision. No confrontation. Not yet. Emotion creates mistakes. Observation creates clarity. I needed clarity. Over the next 3 weeks I watched. The same way I'd watched Richard. The same way I'd watched my ex-husband. Patiently. Quietly. Without assumptions. And the results were heartbreaking. Every significant piece of information I shared with Rebecca eventually resurfaced elsewhere. Not immediately. But consistently. Like water finding the same crack every time it rained. The pattern was undeniable. One afternoon I told her I was considering selling a property. The statement was completely false. 3 days later, settlement discussions unexpectedly referenced that exact property. Again. Confirmation. Painful confirmation. But confirmation nonetheless. I sat in my car afterward, parked beside a quiet lake. Wind rippled across the water. A fisherman adjusted his line near the shore. Children rode bicycles along a nearby path. Life looked peaceful. Meanwhile, 17 years of friendship was collapsing inside my chest. Not exploding. Collapsing silently. Like a building whose foundation had failed long before anyone noticed. The hardest betrayals aren't the ones that shock you. They're the ones that force you to rewrite your memories. And I was beginning to wonder how much of our friendship had been real. That question hurt more than the divorce. The confrontation happened 6 weeks later. Not in a courtroom. Not in a lawyer's office. Not during some dramatic public scene. It happened in my kitchen. The same kitchen where Rebecca and I had shared countless conversations. The same kitchen where she'd comforted me during the separation. The same kitchen where she'd apparently collected information for someone else. She arrived carrying pastries. Comfortable. Confident. A woman expecting another ordinary visit. I poured coffee. We sat down. And for 10 minutes we discussed completely ordinary things. Weather. Travel. Family. Neither of us mentioning what sat inside the folder locked in my study. Then I placed a single document on the table. Nothing more. Just one page. Her smile disappeared instantly. Not gradually. Instantly. That told me everything. People can fake surprise. They struggle to fake recognition. And she recognized it. Immediately. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The room felt impossibly quiet. Finally, she looked up. Not angry. Not defensive. Just defeated. As though she had spent months preparing explanations, she no longer believed herself. I didn't think it would become this. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. I remember staring at her, waiting, hoping, wanting a version of events that somehow made sense. A version that restored the friendship. A version that explained everything. But real life rarely provides convenient explanations. The truth was simpler and sadder. Financial pressure, personal debt, promises, justifications, small compromises that gradually became larger ones. Not a criminal mastermind, not a movie villain. Just a flawed person making increasingly poor decisions. One decision at a time. Until she crossed a line she couldn't uncross. When she finally left, neither of us cried. Neither of us shouted. Some relationships don't end with explosions. Some end with silence. And somehow silence hurts more. I never saw Rebecca again. Not because I hated her. Because there was nothing left to say. The friendship had already ended long before that conversation. We were simply acknowledging it. By winter, everything began unraveling. Not because of revenge. Because of evidence. Carefully documented. Carefully verified. Carefully presented. The timelines. The communications. The financial records. The inconsistencies. Months of patient observation finally formed a complete picture. And complete pictures are difficult to explain away. The most interesting thing about deception is how fragile it becomes once exposed. Maintaining a false story requires coordination. Maintaining the truth requires memory. One is exhausting. The other isn't. Eventually, contradictions appeared. Then more contradictions. Then explanations that contradicted earlier explanations. The structure holding everything together began cracking under its own weight. The settlement negotiations changed dramatically. The confidence disappeared. The pressure tactics stopped. The arrogance vanished. For the first time in nearly a year, the people on the other side seemed uncertain. And uncertainty changes behavior. Fast. I remember leaving one meeting and realizing something strange. I wasn't angry anymore. Months earlier, anger had fueled everything. Now there was mostly exhaustion. And relief. The emotional war was ending. Even if the paperwork wasn't. A year later, I stood on a beach at sunrise. Alone. By choice. Waves rolled steadily toward shore. Seagulls drifted across the horizon. The air smelled of salt and cold wind. For the first time in years, nobody was asking me for documents. Nobody was negotiating. Nobody was leaking information. Nobody was lying to my face. The silence felt different now. Peaceful. Not empty. People often ask whether I felt victorious. The answer surprises them. Not really. Victory implies a winner and a loser. Life is rarely that neat. I lost a marriage. I lost a friendship. I lost trust in people I once respected. Those losses were real. No outcome erased them. What I gained was something quieter. Perspective. Patience. Confidence in my own judgment. The understanding that instincts matter. And the knowledge that truth doesn't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it arrives one document at a time. One inconsistency at a time. One uncomfortable realization at a time. The greatest mistake my ex-husband and his allies made wasn't underestimating my intelligence. It wasn't leaking information. It wasn't becoming careless. Their greatest mistake was assuming desperation would make me stop paying attention. Instead, it made me observe everything. An observation changed the entire story. Even now, years later, I occasionally think about that first settlement meeting. The one where my ex-husband smiled for half a second. The smile that revealed more than he intended. The moment that started everything. If he had controlled that expression. If I had ignored that instinct. If I had dismissed the feeling that something wasn't right. None of what followed would have happened. Sometimes the most important moments in our lives aren't the loud ones. They're the quiet moments when something feels wrong. And we finally decide to trust ourselves enough to investigate. That decision changed my life. Not because it exposed a betrayal. Because it reminded me that my voice, my instincts, and my judgment still mattered. And after everything I'd lost, that was the one thing nobody could take away.